Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're attempting something that really requires stripping away centuries of assumptions, and we want you, the listener, right here in the trenches with us.
Yeah, absolutely in the trenches because what we're tackling today is what's massive.
It is massive. Our mission today is to completely deconstruct a highly specific 1400-year-old text. We're looking at Surah Al-Furqan, specifically verses 47 through 52.
Right.
But I need to set the parameters immediately, right off the bat. We are not doing theology today.
No, definitely
If
not.
you tuned in looking for like a religious manifesto or some collection of sentimental dogmas, you're not going to find that.
Yeah, really not.
Yeah.
Because the source material we're examining, it approaches this text through a radically different lens. I mean, we're going to treat these verses purely as a masterclass in systems engineering.
Yeah, systems engineering and macro sociology. We're hunting for this relentless, rational, socioeconomic blueprint for how civilizations actually survive, adapt, and, thrive.
And that framing is just absolutely critical because historically, traditionalist interpretations of this text have almost universally shoved it into this box of spiritual doctrine, or, in some really unfortunate cases, militaristic doctrine.
Right, which completely misses the point.
Completely misses it. We are impartially contrasting that traditional view with a purely structural analysis today. Because when you strip away the human-engineered traditionalism—
The dogma.
Exactly, the dogma. When you examine the precise sociolinguistic formulas used in the original Arabic, the text just stops reading like a mystical poem. It suddenly reveals itself as this advanced, highly sophisticated manual on organizational capacity and societal feedback loops.
It's basically a manual for systemic resilience. And, to understand why a structural manual like this is even necessary, I want you to think about how we typically diagnose failures in our day-to-day lives.
Oh, that's a great angle.
Because usually, when we talk about diagnosing a problem, there's this underlying expectation of precision, right? Think about engineering or medicine.
Right, you want to point to the exact broken piece.
Exactly. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the orthopedic surgeon just points at the screen and says, there it is, that's the point of failure.
The diagnosis is completely clean. It's visible, structurally apparent.
Yeah. But the human mind just craves that binary simplicity. Broken or not broken.
We really do. We want our failures to be neatly categorized and preferably easy to isolate so we can just apply a quick localized fix. We want a localized patch for a systemic bug.
I love that phrasing, a localized patch for a systemic bug, because then you step into the world of macro sociology, right? The world of civilizational development and collapse, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just utterly useless.
Oh, totally useless. You're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky.
Right. I mean, you and I and everyone listening to this, we see societies failing all around us today. We see economies stagnating, wealth centralizing.
Entire populations just paralyzed by systemic dysfunction.
Exactly. But nobody can point to the exact fracture on an x-ray. We look at the symptoms, the political unrest, the supply chain breakdowns, the institutional decay, and we mistakenly treat those symptoms as the disease itself.
Which is a huge trap, because the fracture is never in the localized symptom. The fracture is always in the foundational social architecture.
Always.
And the tragedy of misdiagnosing that fracture brings us to what might actually be the single most consequential mistranslation in global political history.
We have to go there.
We have to. If we're talking about this specific 1400-year-old text and we're talking about civilizational struggle, we have to address the elephant in the room. We have to talk about the word jihad.
Yeah, let's explode this myth right now, because for centuries, this concept has been almost exclusively read, propagated, and frankly weaponized as armed conflict.
Why?
As pure militarism.
Right. The traditionalist framework has basically pictured it as holy war against external physical enemies.
And the tragic systemic irony here is that this specific reading has led communities to waste vast amounts of kinetic energy, right, and generational resources, just fighting on the perimeter while their internal social architecture completely collapses beneath their feet.
It's just devastating. They're literally swinging swords at the gates while the city behind them rots from within.
A society expending maximum energy on external defense while entirely ignoring internal decay. I mean, that is the ultimate definition of systemic failure.
It really is. And what's profoundly fascinating about our source material today is that it looks at the foundational text itself, specifically verse 52 of Al-Furqan.
Which happens to be the exact verse historically cited to justify this militaristic obsession.
Exactly. And the source reveals that the text is explicitly structurally opposed to that militaristic interpretation.
So let's do the linguistic teardown of that verse. I really want to pull the actual formula apart for the listener.
Go for it.
The precise socio-linguistic instruction in verse 52 is Fala tuti al-kafirina wajahidum bihi jihadan kabira. So if we translate that structurally, just entirely stripping away the theological baggage, it means, do not obey the rejectors and strive against them with IT, with a great striving.
And the load-bearing pillar of that entire structural command is that one word.
Levi? With IT.
With it. The text absolutely does not say strive against them with weapons. It doesn't say strive against them with standing armies. It explicitly says to strive against the systemic resistance using it.
And linguistically, the antecedent to that pronoun, like the it being referred to, is established unequivocally in the preceding verses.
Right. The it is the Furqan itself, the rational social code.
So the Jihad Kabir, the great striving or, the maximum ultimate organizational effort a society can muster, is not a military campaign.
Not at all.
It is an intellectual, social, and organizational effort. It's the relentless, exhausting, highly coordinated implementation of a rational socioeconomic code against the heavy resistance of entrenched vested interests.
Yeah, you are fighting a war of social architecture. You are fighting to install a functional, equitable operating system in a society that has been deeply conditioned to run on a corrupt, extractive operating system.
And physical force is statistically the least effective tool for changing a societal operating system.
Right. You cannot shoot a bad idea out of the collective consciousness.
No, you really can't.
You cannot bomb deeply ingrained social conditioning. You can only dismantle a corrupt architecture with a superior, rationally applied socioeconomic code. That's what the Jihad Kabir is. It's the maximum organizational striving required to make that rational code the dominant architecture of the society.
Okay, so if we accept that premise, that the ultimate goal is installing and maintaining this robust, highly functional, civilizational operating system, my immediate question as a systems analyst is about maintenance.
Okay, where are you going with this?
Well, how does a society running this incredibly high-intensity code manage its day-to-day operations without just burning out its citizens? I mean, how does it manage time, labor, and rest? Let's transition into how this text handles the concept of structural downtime.
That's a vital transition, because any engineer listening to this knows that a system's efficiency is heavily dependent on how it manages its operational cycles.
Right.
And its cooling periods.
Exactly. If a system runs at maximum capacity indefinitely, the friction just destroys the hardware.
Traditionally, human societies have managed this friction through the concept of the holiday, the holy day of rest.
Yeah, we see this across multiple traditions. You've got the Sabbath on Saturday, Sunday in the Christian tradition, and even the cultural adaptation of Friday in many Islamic societies as a day where the entire economic machine just halts.
Right. Everything just stops. And our sources point out that these traditional holy days of rest are entirely engineered by human tradition. They're often rooted in ancient anthropomorphic mythologies.
Right, like the underlying mythology is usually this idea that a creator deity worked for 6 days, experienced biological fatigue, and physically needed to take a nap on the 7th.
Exactly. The traditionalist framework projects human biological limitations onto the fundamental mechanics of the universe.
Which, from a rational systems perspective, is an absurd projection.
Totally absurd.
The universe doesn't take a day off. Gravity doesn't decide to take a nap on Sundays.
The thermodynamic processes of the sun do not pause for the weekend.
Right. So the Quranic countermodel, as detailed in our sources, explicitly rejects this entire paradigm of the holy day off. In this rational code, there is no concept of a complete cessation of the socioeconomic machine.
Every single day holds equal systemic value. The machine never powers down.
But let me push back on that because I can hear the listener's counter-argument forming right now in their head.
Let's hear it.
If you're telling me the economy doesn't stop, the factories don't close, and the supply chains don't pause, won't the human components of that system suffer catastrophic burnout? You simply cannot run a society at a 100% capacity 204/7 without a complete mental and physical collapse of the workforce.
And that is the essential paradox to resolve. And the text resolves it by making a vital distinction between the societal engine and the individual components.
Okay, unpack that.
The system itself doesn't stop, but the roles within the system dynamically shift. To understand this, The source material examines the specific instruction regarding Friday, which is known as Jumu'ah.
Right.
The text strictly designates this not as a day of rest, but as a day of assembly and consultation, what the Arabic text refers to as salat.
Ah, okay. So it's essentially a massive society-wide town hall. It's a synchronization meeting.
Yes, think of it as a period where the active individual pursuit of economic resources is temporarily paused so that the community can synchronize its data, calibrate its social architecture, and make collective decisions.
So the individual focus shifts from microeconomic survival to macro-organizational alignment.
Precisely. But here is the critical systemic mechanism. The text explicitly instructs that the moment this consultation is over, the human components must immediately disperse.
Immediately.
Yes. The specific Arabic word used is tasharu.
And the linguistic root of tasharu implies a rapid, almost urgent scattering, doesn't it?
Yes, they don't linger. They don't go home to lounge on the couch for the rest of the day. They disperse immediately back into the economic engine.
The instruction is to aggressively seek the bounty or the economic resources, so the system of socioeconomic production is continuous. What pauses is merely the individual isolated economic focus, which temporarily shifts to a collective organizational focus.
Exactly. The societal engine maintains its hum. The gears just shift their alignment for a brief period of calibration.
But I want to ground this in the reality of the listener. If you're working in a modern corporate environment, you know that the company doesn't cease to exist when you have an all-hands meeting. The overarching goals of the company are still active. You simply stop coding or stop selling for 1 hour to make sure everyone understands the new operating procedure, and then you immediately go back to your desk to execute it.
That is the macro-sociological model being proposed here, but on a civilizational scale. The societal infrastructure never takes a holiday.
Okay, but this forces us to address the biological reality you raised earlier. If the society doesn't rely on superstitious holidays for rest, how does the human biological machine get its necessary downtime? Because human biology has hard-coded limits.
It absolutely does. And this brings us directly to verse 47, which completely redefines the concept of rest by shifting the focus from societal holidays to the biological imperative of sleep.
And the linguistic deep dive the source performs on this verse is absolutely brilliant.
It really is. So verse 47 describes the mechanism of sleep using the word tawafa.
Right. And tawafa is frequently mistranslated, isn't it? Or oversimplified.
Very much so. It literally translates to a complete taking back of a full reclaiming of a given thing. It describes sleep essentially as a minor death of the active consciousness.
And it pairs this action with the word subat.
Yes, subat, which means a cutoff, a severance, or a disconnection.
Our source uses a really powerful analogy here, comparing this biological process to an electrical circuit. Let's map out that analogy because it perfectly illustrates the systemic function.
Sure. So think of your active conscious mind as the light bulb, and your biological hardware, your brainstem, your autonomic nervous system, your cellular infrastructure as the underlying wiring and power grid.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
When you enter a state of subat, or sleep, it is the equivalent of flipping the switch on that specific circuit. The active consciousness is abruptly disconnected from the sensory inputs.
You no longer process the visual data of the room around you?
Right. You stop registering ambient auditory noise, and you entirely lose your active processing of time.
The connection is severed. The light bulb goes dark. But to expand on this, I actually like to think of it like putting a high-end server into sleep mode.
Oh, that's a great modern parallel.
Right. If you're running a massive, complex database and you put the server to sleep, the act of processing the RAM suspends its operations to save power. The display monitor goes black. The user interface completely logs.
But the data hasn't been deleted.
Exactly. The hard drive is still entirely intact, just humming in the background. The cooling fans might still be spinning to regulate the temperature. The underlying machinery is very much alive.
That server analogy captures the precise mechanical reality of tawafa. While the active consciousness is severed, your heart maintains its rhythm, your lungs continue to draw in oxygen, and your cellular repair mechanisms actually kick into overdrive.
Yeah, and furthermore, the subconscious storehouse, that massive database of your memory and identity, remains fully intact and incredibly active.
So when the power returns, when you hit the space bar to wake the server up in the morning, the system boots up and reconnects to the exact state it was in before the suspension.
There is zero loss of data. You wake up knowing your name, recognizing your family, and remembering the tasks you left unfinished yesterday.
The active consciousness is reclaimed and then seamlessly returned.
Okay, so we've established the biological reality, but we have to remember that our source material is relentlessly socioeconomic. It's not delivering a biology lecture purely for the sake of scientific trivia.
No, not at all. The text introduces the biology of sleep to serve as a diagnostic metaphor for macro sociology. Just as an individual consciousness can be temporarily disconnected and then reactivated without being permanently destroyed, an entire civilization can enter a state of dormancy.
A civilizational sleep mode. I mean, that is a profound concept. We're talking about an entire society losing its active consciousness.
Exactly. A society can stop processing reality rationally. It can become intellectually stagnant, economically paralyzed, and entirely disconnected from forward progress.
Look at historical examples like the European Dark Ages following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire.
Or look at massive modern bureaucratic institutions that have become so gridlocked by their own rules that they can no longer innovate.
Yeah. Traditionalist historians might look at these periods and declare the society dead. But the structural argument of this text is that the dormant society is not permanently deceased.
The fundamental infrastructure is still there.
Right. The human capital, the geographical resources, the accumulated historical memory, the hard drive of the civilization is still completely intact. Its rational, discriminatory capacities are simply powered down.
The society is in a macro state of Subat. The circuitry is intact, but the switch has been flipped off.
Which naturally leads to the most critical operational question. If a society is in sleep mode, or if we look at the other powerful metaphor the text uses, a landscape where the topsoil has hardened into absolute cracked sterility, how do you trigger the wake-up sequence?
Right. How do you hit the space bar on a dormant civilization? Well, you cannot rely on the dormant system to wake itself up. A closed, dormant system requires a catalyst. It requires a highly specific, pure external input to break the cycle of stagnation.
And this brings us to the analysis of verses 48 and 49, where the text transitions from the biology of sleep to the systems biology of meteorology to explain societal reactivation.
The meteorological metaphor is so brilliant because it anchors these incredibly abstract sociological theories in undeniable, observable physical realities.
It points to the mechanics of the wind and the rain.
And it breaks these natural phenomena down into their systemic functions. Let's examine the wind first. The text describes the wind using the term bushra.
Bushra is typically translated as glad tidings, right? But in a structural context, it functions as advanced intelligence.
Yes, it functions as predictive data. In an agrarian society, the shifting of the wind, the change in barometric pressure, is the informational signal that a productive change is approaching.
It signals that the stagnant, heavy, oppressive atmosphere is about to be aggressively disrupted.
It's the leading indicator. It's the data packet arriving just before the actual physical input, and the input itself is the water, the rain.
And the source describes this water falling on burr, a term denoting completely sterile, dead, hardened land.
This sterile land, this burr, is the ultimate analogy for a society that has been suppressed and hardened by corrupted traditions.
So the rain is the analogy for the Furqan, the rational code, being introduced to this stagnant society.
Exactly. But the source makes a vital, scientifically precise distinction about the quality of this water. It does not just say water, it uses the term tahura.
Pure, fundamentally distilled water.
The thermodynamic analogy the source extracts from this is remarkable. Consider how the planetary ecosystem creates this pure water. The sun radiates heat down onto the ocean.
Right.
The ocean is an absolutely massive body of water, but it is fundamentally undrinkable. It's heavy, it's saturated with salt, it's full of toxic impurities. If you water crops with ocean water, you will kill the soil permanently.
So applying that to our social architecture framework, human history, cultural dogma, and accumulated tradition are the ocean. They represent a massive body of historical data, but they are full of toxic, heavy, undrinkable impurities.
You're talking about irrational superstitions, extractive class hierarchies, and self-serving dogmas engineered by the elites.
Right, so what does the sun do?
The heat of the sun evaporates the water molecules, executing a perfect distillation process. It leaves all the heavy, toxic impurities, the salts of human tradition, behind in the ocean.
Wow.
The vapor rises, condenses in the atmosphere, and eventually falls as tahura. It falls as perfectly distilled, life-giving water.
And the Furqan, the rational social code, operates identically. It is the distilled truth, systematically separated from the toxic contamination of human tradition. It is a pure, uncorrupted systemic input.
And when that pure, distilled rational code is introduced to the sterile, hardened society, the burr, we see the reactivation sequence begin.
But I really want to highlight a specific biological reality that the text focuses on here because it fundamentally changes how we view human potential. The water falling from the sky does not create the seeds in the ground.
No, the seeds were already present. The potential for flourishing life was always latent, hiding just beneath the dead soil.
The water is merely the chemical catalyst. It softens the hard, impenetrable crust of the soil, penetrates the surface, and interacts with the latent potential that was trapped underneath.
And the societal potential of human beings never actually leaves. The raw intelligence, the capacity for technological innovation, the inherent drive for equity and justice, these qualities are always latent within any given population.
They just lack the necessary uncorrupted input to break through the hardened social conditioning that is suppressing them.
Right. So the synthesis of this meteorological section is a profound macro-sociological formula. The introduction of the right input, the pure, rational social code, is all that is necessary to reactivate the discriminative capacity of a sterile community.
Once the code penetrates the conditioning, revival is a predictable mechanical reality.
The theory is mathematically elegant.
It is, but if we pull back and look at the real world, if we follow the logic of the system to its natural conclusion, we collide with a massive historical contradiction.
Okay, let's address the contradiction.
If this pure water, this distilled rational code, has rained down repeatedly throughout human history, if the signal has been consistently sent and the data is readily available, why isn't every single society on Earth flourishing?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. Why do civilizations still routinely collapse? Why are we currently surrounded by so much barren, sterile institutional land today?
That contradiction is exactly what verse 50 addresses, and it serves as perhaps the most critical diagnostic tool in the entire text. It forces us to examine the mechanics of systemic resistance.
Let's analyze the first half of verse 50. It states, وَلَقَدْ صَرَفْنَهُ بَيْنَهُمْ لِيَضْحَكُوا. We have repeated it or circulated it among them so they might activate or remember.
Pay close attention to the word sarafnahu. It implies a deliberate rotation, a systematic circulation of data from multiple varying angles.
So the text is establishing a baseline diagnostic fact. The failure of these societies is absolutely not due to a lack of data.
Exactly. The rational code has been presented repeatedly. It has been demonstrated through multiple historical messengers, tested in multiple communities, and validated by multiple historical outcomes. The empirical evidence for the rational code is fully available on the table.
The data has been repeatedly published, but the second half of the verse provides the grim sociological reality. But most people refuse everything except concealment.
And to understand this, we must aggressively strip away the theological baggage that has contaminated the word kufur.
Yeah, traditionalist frameworks have historically translated kufur as disbelief or sin in a purely spiritual, esoteric sense.
But structurally and linguistically, kufur means the active concealment of evidence. It is the deliberate refusal to register available verified data.
It's the equivalent of a patient looking at the X-ray, clearly seeing the jagged fracture in their bone, and deliberately throwing the X-ray in the incinerator while claiming their arm is fine.
It's total denial.
So my analytical question, and I think the question any systems engineer would ask here, is this. Is this just an inherent fatal flaw in human biology? Are human beings statistically wired to be irrational, self-destructive creatures?
It's a fair question because the verse explicitly says most people, the statistical majority, not just a fringe minority, default to this active concealment.
Right. So are we just doomed by our own brains?
No, it's not an inherent biological flaw, and it's not a moral failing in the conventional sense. It is a pure systems phenomenon.
Yeah.
It is entirely driven by the path of least resistance.
I want to explore that. How does the path of least resistance lead to the active concealment of data and ultimately civilizational collapse?
You have to analyze who controls the environment in which these people operate. Extractive vested interests, the elite class who disproportionately benefit from maintaining the sterile, stagnant society. They engineer the social architecture specifically to protect their extraction.
They design the system to make the act of applying rational discrimination incredibly costly for the average citizen.
To use our earlier metaphor, the elites intentionally pave over the topsoil. They lay down a thick layer of industrial concrete to ensure the rain can never reach the seeds.
They create severe social, economic, and political penalties for anyone who attempts to absorb the water. Let's apply this to a modern context. If you're listening right now, imagine your own workplace or industry.
Right. If questioning the extractive economic system means you get blacklisted from your industry, or you lose your social standing, or in many historical cases you lose your physical freedom or your life, then engaging with the rational code becomes an incredibly high-cost action.
Rationality is actively penalized by the system.
And human beings, when operating within any system, will statistically default to the action that requires the least immediate energy and carries the lowest immediate risk. It's Behavioral Economics 101.
When a society's architecture structurally penalizes reason, the statistical majority will default to Kufur.
They will ignore the data, conceal the truth, and uphold the broken status quo simply as a survival mechanism. It is a perfectly predictable, rational response to a highly toxic, engineered social architecture.
They choose the path of least resistance to survive the day, even if that path mathematically guarantees long-term civilizational ruin. The short-term cost of resistance is artificially inflated by the elites to make compliance the only viable option.
So it's a completely engineered cognitive dissonance on a mass scale.
The society is literally dying of thirst, the pure rain is falling from the sky, but the vested interests have convinced everyone that opening their mouth to drink the water is a treasonous crime. So the vast majority keep their mouths tightly shut and quietly die of dehydration.
That is terrifying, but it perfectly explains institutional inertia. That engineered inertia is the exact mechanism of civilizational failure described in verse 50.
If the statistical majority defaults to this resistance because of engineered social conditioning, where does the solution lie? How do we break the concrete when the elites own the construction company?
This leads us to verse 51 and the vital concept of organizational capacity. Verse 51 defines the scope of the modern solution. It states, "If we willed, we would have sent a warner to every town."
The analogy our source uses here is brilliant because it bridges the ancient and the modern. It compares this ancient text to modern global communications theory.
Let's break that down.
In the ancient world, if you wanted to change the operating system of a society, you had to send a physical human messenger walking to every single geographically isolated village. The distribution of data was intensely physical and slow.
But today, the signal is broadcasting worldwide instantaneously. We have fiber optic cables, global data networks, satellite internet.
We do not need local physical messengers to deliver the rational code anymore. The bandwidth for data transmission is effectively infinite.
The availability of the data is no longer the bottleneck in the system. The rational code, the Furqan, is universally accessible to anyone with a smartphone.
What verse 51 implies and what the source analyzes so deeply is that the limit to civilizational revival is no longer the availability of the signal. The limit is a community's receptive capacity.
Receptive capacity. In information theory, it's not just about how strong the transmitter is, but whether the receiver is actually turned on, tuned to the correct frequency, and capable of decoding the signal.
More fundamentally, is the societal hardware capable of processing the signal without immediately short-circuiting due to the social penalties we discussed?
This brings us to the core operating principle of the universe according to this text, the law of requital, or mukafat amal.
The universal law of action and reaction, cause and effect in the socioeconomic sphere.
Let's apply the rain and the concrete analogy one more time to demonstrate how the law of requital operates. The pure water is falling. The data is broadcasting globally.
The productive potential, the latent seeds of human ingenuity, are present beneath the surface.
But the social conditioning orchestrated by the vested interests has made the topsoil completely impenetrable. It is solid concrete.
So, according to the law of requital, what is the mechanical result when pure rain hits solid concrete?
It just runs off into the gutters. It might cause damaging flash floods, but it absolutely does not grow anything. It cannot penetrate the surface to trigger the chemical catalysts with the seeds.
The law of requital dictates that the environment must be made structurally conducive to the input. The pure code cannot force a society to bloom against its will. The community must actively develop its receptive capacity.
They must organize and actively choose to run the discrimination tool, the rational code, despite the heavy social, economic, and political costs engineered by the elites.
They have to grab heavy machinery. They have to grab jackhammers and start physically breaking up the concrete, even while the elites are screaming at them to stop and threatening their livelihoods. That requires immense coordinated effort.
It requires maximum effort. But here is the remarkable, mathematically guaranteed promise of the system. When a community finally organizes, when they endure the friction and successfully break the concrete to allow the code to penetrate the hard soil, The revival is not a slow, centuries-long process.
It's rapid.
It is extremely rapid. Just as a dead, arid desert can bloom seemingly overnight after a sudden, heavy rainfall, a society that aligns its social architecture with a rational code generates massive productive capacity with astonishing speed.
The potential was always there, waiting just millimeters below the surface for the structural barrier to be removed.
We have mapped the entire system. We know the topsoil is hard. We know the vested interests intentionally paved it over to protect their extractive power. We know the pure water, the rational code is available and actively falling.
So how do we finally practically organize the jackhammers to break the soil?
This brings us full circle. This brings us back to the mistranslation we exploded in our hook. It brings us back to verse 52 and the synthesis of the entire socioeconomic blueprint, the Jihad Kabir, the great striving.
Let's look at the first structural command of verse 52 again. Do not obey the rejectors. It starts with a negative command, a prohibition. Before you can build anything new, before you can swing a single jackhammer, you must stop obeying the architects who poured the concrete in the first place.
That is the absolute, non-negotiable structural precondition for any genuine systemic reform. You must establish complete intellectual, financial, and organizational independence from the extractive architecture you are trying to replace.
If your reform movement relies on the vested interests for your social standing, your political funding, or your institutional validation, you mathematically cannot dismantle their system. You are beholden to their feedback loops.
Because the moment you compromise your independence, the moment you try to adapt the rational code just to make it palatable to the elites, to make your reform movement seem respectable or moderate within the framework of a broken system, you completely neutralize the code.
You contaminate the pure distilled water with salt before it ever has a chance to hit the ground.
A rational code that has been artificially modified to protect irrational, entrenched privileges is no longer a rational code. It loses all of its discriminatory power. Independence is the strict prerequisite for application.
And once you have secured that uncompromised independence, then comes the execution phase. Then comes the Jihad Kabir. You strive against the vested interests with it, with the Furqan, with the pure code.
This is the ultimate synthesis of everything we have unpacked. The Jihad Kabir is the sustained, highly organized, maximum effort application of the rational social code.
It is an exhausting intellectual campaign designed to systematically deprogram the population's social conditioning.
It is a grueling organizational campaign to build alternative, parallel structures that reward rationality instead of penalizing it.
It is the coordinated effort to fundamentally alter the path of least resistance for the statistical majority so that engaging with reality and demanding equity is no longer a high-cost, dangerous action.
It is arguably the hardest work a society can ever undertake. It requires exponentially more courage, discipline, strategic planning, and intellectual endurance than simply picking up a weapon and fighting a chaotic physical war on the perimeter.
Because it is a war against your own society's systemic inertia. It is a war against the comfortable familiarity of the status quo.
And our source brings in a beautiful, highly clarifying, poetic analogy here from the philosopher Iqbal regarding the relationship between physical force and intellectual code, the relationship between the sword and the book.
I think this is vital to include because someone listening might ask, does physical power or state authority have no place at all in civilizational survival? Are we just supposed to write essays while the elites crush us?
Iqbal's analogy clarifies the systemic hierarchy perfectly. The sword representing physical power, military might, or state authority is merely a tool. It is entirely neutral.
Without the rational code, the book, the Furqan, the sword, is pure, unguided destruction. It is chaos.
The code is the primary weapon of civilizational change. Physical power merely exists in a secondary role to guard the code. It exists solely to protect the environment where the code can be safely applied, descending it from those vested interests who would try to forcefully, violently suppress the reformers.
The sword guards the jackhammer. But the jackhammer, the rational code, does the actual work of breaking the concrete. If you just wildly swing a sword at industrial concrete, you will just shatter the blade, exhaust your energy, and achieve absolutely nothing. The concrete remains intact.
The Jihad Kabir is the disciplined application of the code. The moment a reform movement substitutes the intellectual code for the physical sword as their primary method of change, they have already lost the structural war. They have become just another extractive force.
So, as we wrap up this macro-sociological teardown, let's zoom out and look at the journey we've just taken together. We started by aggressively stripping away centuries of theological myths. We dismantled the myth of holy wars fought with swords, and we dismantled the myth of holy days off where the mechanics of the universe simply pause.
And beneath those superstitious layers, we revealed a stark, incredibly precise socioeconomic blueprint for how a civilization actually revives itself.
We observe the mechanical reality that societies don't die permanently. They enter a dormant state of Subat when their engineered social conditioning blocks the pure, distilled input of rational discrimination.
We analyzed how the masses aren't inherently foolish or biologically doomed. They are rationally reacting to a toxic system that penalizes reason, forcing them down the path of least resistance into kufr, the active concealment of truth, just to survive their daily lives.
And finally, we established that the only proven mechanism to shatter that concrete, to allow the water of the rational code to penetrate and rapidly reactivate the latent potential of the society, is the Jihad Kabir.
The maximum, uncompromising, fiercely independent organizational effort to apply the rational social code.
So here is a final provocative thought I want to leave you with as you go about your day. Take this 1,400-year-old systemic diagnostic tool and apply it to the world immediately outside your window.
Look at the failing institutions around us today.
Look at our gridlocked, theatrical political bodies. Look at our highly extractive financial systems that consolidate wealth while communities decay. Look at our stagnating educational models.
These institutions are absolutely drowning in data. They are flooded with water. We have more information, more scientific reports, and more predictive analyses than any civilization in the history of human existence.
Yet nothing grows. The institutional soil remains totally, stubbornly sterile.
The pure signal is broadcasting at maximum volume globally, but the receptive capacity of our society is entirely blocked by concrete.
I want you to ask yourself, what specific vested interests have paved over the topsoil of our modern society? What specific social and economic penalties have they engineered to make rationality so costly for the average person today?
And most importantly, if you were to organize it, what would a modern Jihad Kabir, a maximum organizational striving using a relentlessly rational code, actually look like to break up that concrete in your own community?
Because the water is falling. The data is here. The only question left is whether we are going to grab the jackhammers and let it penetrate or just stand by and let it wash us away.